And the people from AOL came in the room, threw down the contract, and said, "We've been talking about this long enough. You have 2 hours to sign," and walked out of the room.
Wow.
Now, they had already been notorious for doing things like this.
Yeah.
But it's one thing to hear about it. It's another thing to be in the room.
Well, especially when it could be the make or break for the company.
It was absolutely the make or break for the company.
Adam, welcome to Masters of Scale.
Thank you for having me.
You are the founder of what is perhaps the most important tech company in LA that people don't really know about. So tell us about Cornerstone.
So Cornerstone started in the early days of the web and SaaS, before there was such a thing as SaaS, with a focus on using the internet to educate people.
It's a broad mission.
Very big idea.
Yeah.
And so the first thing we did is hone in on who are we going to educate. We ruled out kids. We ruled out students because we thought we were going to be leveraging the universities as content providers. And so we didn't want to compete with them. So we said, okay, no kids, no college students. Let's focus on adults. And it's a little bit counterintuitive because what do adults need to learn? Well, we know today that adults need to keep learning.
In my
Technology
case,
is
it's a
changing
lot.
fast.
Yeah.
There's a lot to learn.
Yeah.
And interestingly, adults have the least access to education because they often are working 9 to 5 or more. And so they can't leave in the middle of the day to go to class. So synchronous learning doesn't work that well. And training can be really expensive. A lot of people can't afford it. And so we thought the internet is going to become this great equalizer that will make it very easy to deliver training to adults.
And just situate us. This is 1990.
This is 1999.
Okay. So it's really the advent of the consumer internet at scale.
And interestingly, training requires a lot of bandwidth. So not only did you need the web to be able to deliver this concept, but you actually needed enough bandwidth that a course could be delivered online.
Okay.
Today, obviously, super easy to do.
Yeah.
In 1999, it was impossible.
Yeah.
This is a time of dial-up modems.
So just to take a half step back, if you would, like, why this problem? Why did you latch on to this idea as this problem to solve for?
So I loved education. I ended up getting 2 degrees undergrad, and then I went to law school and business school, and I got a CPA. I just loved learning. My parents were worried that I would never get a real job, which was a real possibility. And I was very interested in the idea of helping people get educated. In fact, in business school, there was a competition for a business pitch, business planning competition. And the idea we came up with was using CD-ROMs to train adults at concepts that were difficult for adults to understand, like Wall Street.
Fantastic. I have to pause you because you and I are old enough to know what a CD-ROM is, but not everyone who's listening or watching is.
Yeah, so you might have seen a DVD. CD-ROMs were like the early version of the DVD where you could put more compressed data on a disc. And so the early CDs were solely for music. The early CD-ROMs were used for games and classes.
Gotcha. So this is almost like the origins of Netflix, where it's like, we'll send you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. This was pre-streaming, really pre-web.
Yeah.
At the time.
And is this idea born out of one of the many dorm rooms that you were living in? Or like, I appreciate the origin in education because that was a passion, but like, where were you when the inspiration really hit for this?
You know, I was at business school at UCLA. I did the JD MBA program at UCLA. And there was an opportunity to see firsthand what was happening in the CD-ROM business because it was all about edutainment, right? Part education, part entertainment. And LA was the place that CD-ROMs were happening. Ironically, it was a terrible technology.
How so?
When the web came about, it was obvious that nobody would use these things anymore. Similar to how Netflix realized people were going to stream and stop going to the store to pick up discs. We saw a huge opportunity to do this over the internet, but the challenge was bandwidth. So the CD-ROM business, the idea was really premised on leveraging the technology to help people learn things.
Gotcha.
Because it was more interactive, it was self-paced, it was easy to access, and it wasn't expensive.
So you've identified a challenge and an opportunity, right? Adult education, right? How do we make this efficient for people? You've identified a means of distribution in the CD-ROM. This is still late 90s now, early 2000s, not...
So the CD-ROM idea was during business school. It was 1994.
Okay.
My partner wanted me to drop out of school. I had one semester left to get both a law degree and a business degree. I said, my parents will kill me.
Right.
There's no way I'm doing it.
Right.
I'm going to finish school and then we'll potentially start this company. But by the way, this is the wrong technology. I even knew then it was going to be the wrong technology.
Because you could see streaming coming?
Not streaming. You could see the web coming.
Right. You could see a higher bandwidth web coming.
Exactly.
Yeah.
By 99, the consumer internet had exploded.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of opportunity out there. But bandwidth still was not very good. So this idea of being able to deliver a whole class over the internet was not really feasible. So I became very obsessed with bandwidth and was watching what was happening with the cable modems and DSL and thought, I'll start the company when we're about 2 years away from full broadband in the home.
And how would you have
I thought was 99.
Okay.
I was wrong.
Yeah.
It didn't happen until many years later.
Yeah.
But that seemed to be the right time to start a company, get it going, build the business, and over a 2-year period, you would have product that could be delivered over the internet.
Right. You're basically you're anticipating when the way you're looking a few sets out, you're looking for the wave that's coming and you want to catch that wave that's coming in.
Exactly.
Right. Okay. But you mistimed it.
Mistimed it. In fact, terribly timed it. So I was working at an investment bank at the time. I wanted to understand finance. I had gone to business school undergrad. I had gone to get an MBA, but I still felt like I didn't understand business fully. There was an enormous opportunity to leverage the education I had with a Wall Street education to fully understand, how do you finance a business? How do you grow a business? And how do you do M&A? How do IPOs work? I wanted to understand that black box.
Yep.
So I was working on Wall Street, realized the timing was right, or I thought it was right at the time, and said, I'm going to start the company. So I went to tell my boss that I was starting this company. And I had seen that anybody who had left the firm was immediately escorted by security guards out of the building because investment banks have confidential information. And so they're very concerned about people having access to the information and taking it with them.
So it's like being perp walked basically out of the building.
The second you resign.
Yeah.
And I expected that was going to happen to me.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm fully prepared for it. And I go to my boss and I say, I'm leaving. Why are you leaving? I'm going to start a company. He says, oh, we all knew you were going to do that. How much time do you need and how much money are you trying to raise?
Wow.
I tell him, I probably need a couple of months to do the business plan, and I probably need a few $100,000 to get this going.
Which to the investment bank was like a few $100 probably.
And he said, okay, great. We'll give it to you.
Wow.
So no security guard showed up. I never left the office. I wrote the business plan while finishing up work, and my initial capital came from everybody I work for. So investment banks are very bureaucratic.
Yeah.
And so I was an associate. You have a director and a vice president and a managing director and vice chairman and so on and so forth. Every single person in my chain of command invested in the company.
They invested personally. This wasn't
personally. Yeah. And the analysts who worked for me also put in $5,000.
Wow. Wow. That's quite a vote of confidence.
And it was incredible. So the original name of the company was CyberU.
Mm-hmm.
This is back in the day of cyber everything.
Yep.
It was a great opportunity. It was very, very misleading for me.
How so?
Because that start was so incredibly easy. And that was the end of it being easy.
That was the end of easy.
That was the beginning and end of the easy time for the company.
What got hard?
I ended up spending the next 7 years trying to raise money for the business.
And you started as a direct-to-consumer business, right? You were doing a B2C company?
The very original idea was to leverage the internet to deliver training to adults. And so we thought adults are in one of three places. They're at home. Today we call them consumers. They were inside of a small business that they had started or worked for, or they were part of a large enterprise. And so the very original idea of the company was written on a whiteboard in my one-bedroom apartment, which had 3 boxes on top, which was universities, corporate training providers, and new companies that would deliver training over the internet. And the 3 boxes at the bottom were adults at home as consumers, adults in small businesses, or adults in large enterprises. And in the middle was CyberU. And CyberU was intended to be, at the time, what they called a mid-intermediary. We're going to sit between the sellers of education, like universities, and the buyers of education, who would be adults.
And universities were not online the way they are today. You couldn't go take a Yale or Stanford class online back then. So
we found all the universities that were at the cutting edge of doing this. Rochester Institute of Technology. Actually, UCLA was very early in this.
But how do
Berkeley was
you
very
can't, it's not
early.
like you could go on the internet and look up who's doing this. So were you just calling them?
We would call. We would get brochures. We would look on the internet. And in fact, the very first thing we did when the company started in New York, 3 months in, moved it to LA.
Why?
New York's a very lonely place to start a company. Big city, lots of people, very expensive, and nobody was working with me. I was literally home alone in this one-bedroom apartment trying to get this company off the ground. And so I came up with this pattern where every day I would go to Staples and buy something. I'd usually only buy one thing. Like
Just
I'd go
to
and
get
buy
out of the
a
house,
pen
just to get out of the apartment and do
because
something?
it made me feel like I was starting a company. Like I was doing something business related. You ever go into Staples?
Sure.
It's like a business store.
Yeah.
So I went there to buy business stuff.
Yeah.
I didn't even know what I was supposed to be buying.
It didn't matter.
It didn't matter. It gave me purpose. It gave me something to do every day. And one day I was walking to the store. I get out of the store, and you've been in New York. It is pouring rain. And this is pre-Uber. I could not get a taxi. I didn't really even need to be there in the first place. And I end up having to walk home in the pouring rain, thinking to myself, there's got to be a better way to do this.
This is a metaphor.
It's got to be easier.
Yeah.
And I decided, that's it. I'm going to do this in LA.
But you'd been in LA, and you and I both love LA, so we can extol LA all day long. But in that era, most tech entrepreneurs would have been like, I'm headed to Silicon Valley.
Which is why when I told people I was going to California, they all said, okay, great. Because remember, all my investors were from New York.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. You're going to Silicon Valley. That's great. That's where you should go.
Yeah.
I said, oh no, I'm going to LA. And they said, you can't go to LA. You can either stay in New York or you could go to San Francisco.
Right.
Those are your only 2 choices. And I came up with this very convoluted reason that LA made sense, which was a lot of educational software companies were based in LA back in the 90s.
Okay.
And so that became my excuse for being in LA.
But the real reason
was I wanted to be by the beach. I wanted to be somewhere nice. And I thought it would be cheaper and easier to start a company here and be a bigger fish in a smaller pond.
And this is, I mean,
and that turned out to be absolutely true.
So I want to understand this, because this is pre-MySpace, pre-Snap, pre-SpaceX,
everything.
The tech boom in LA that has lured so many software developers, product people. I mean, the talent pipeline in LA in the last 15 years has been insane.
Explosive.
But we're talking more than 20 years ago. So like, how did it end up being an advantage when there was a dearth of talent here relative to the Bay?
So remember, this is when there was a couple of people working in the company. So I wasn't thinking about scaling the business at the time. I was thinking about how do I get anybody to work for me?
Mm-hmm.
And New York was really expensive.
Yeah.
I couldn't afford to pay people what they needed to pay rent.
Mm-hmm.
And in LA, I could, at least at the time.
Yeah.
And so I was able to convince people to quit their jobs and join the company in a way that I couldn't do it in New York.
What was your pitch? How did you persuade people? I mean, you're a fledgling company. You've raised, a few $100,000, pre-product market fit. How are you recruiting people?
The first 6 people were all people I knew.
Okay.
They were my friends.
Yeah.
And people always say, don't work with your friends. I did not follow that rule. I was working with my friends.
Okay.
Interestingly, of the 6 people that we started with, only 2 of them kind of stayed for the long term.
What was it about the 2 who stuck around?
I don't know if we were all too dumb or too optimistic about what the possibilities were, but we were having a great time.
Yeah.
And we were really trying to figure things out.
In those early days, were you selling the mission of the company?
Absolutely. It was all about the mission, the opportunity. Honestly, even when we had thousands of employees,
yeah,
it was still about the mission. It was about what we were doing. Our tagline was educating the world. And when we started the company, that was completely absurd. But when I sold the company, we had delivered 2 billion courses. So we kind of did educate the world.
So there's a little bit that happens between hiring these 6 people and 2 billion people served.
The short story on the company is we started with this idea that we were going to be in any of these 3 different markets, right? We were going to help adults at home as individuals, in these small businesses, and at big companies. And so the very first thing we did is we hired web developers to build a website. We hired a team of students from UCLA and USC who sat at these folding tables with folding chairs. I'm not exaggerating. In this 1-bedroom office on Ocean Park. And they would surf the web looking for any online training that was out there.
With the goal.
Any university or any course that was sitting out there, with the goal that we would tabulate and simplify the ability to search for online courses. That was the original consumer idea.
Marketplace for education.
Marketplace for education, exactly. What today would be like Udemy or Coursera.
Yeah.
But back then, nothing like that existed. We got very far along with America Online at the time.
How so?
AOL was the kingmaker. And we were given the ability to become the premier partner for the Research and Learn Center on America Online. And America Online was organized by these different areas, sports, finance, business, and there was a section for training and education. Anybody who became the premier sponsor of one of those sections dominated the internet.
I mean, we just have
time.
to situate for the younger audience. Like AOL was basically synonymous with the consumer internet in this era, right?
AOL was the equivalent of Google and Amazon and eBay and. It was the whole internet.
So one doesn't necessarily just call up AOL and say, hey, could we do this?
No, it
How
was
does
a
this
super
happen?
competitive process. We had to fly around the country back and forth to try to win the opportunity to pay them as the top sponsor of that site. We pulled all-nighters to get ready for these meetings, and we ended up winning.
Why did you win?
We were doing something really innovative, and others didn't understand what the opportunity was out there and what was going to happen with the internet. They didn't have the vision that we had at the time. And we had a personable team. We were young and scrappy and excited to do this, and they loved it. And we probably were also a little bit impressionable and inexperienced, and so they were able to take advantage of us also.
AOL had a lot of power in that day. So
a lot of power.
You said you were paying for the spot. Was this a percentage of revenue, or was this going to be?
We were going to pay for the spot. It was going to be cash outlay and a percent of revenue. It was both.
Yep.
Very expensive at the time.
Yep.
And we had very little money. So the assumption was that we would be able to raise money to be able to
Make the
fund
deal,
make
then
the deal,
raise the
some
money to pay for the deal, build the
Exactly.
airplane on the way down.
Exactly. And other companies that have done something like this had done very well at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But this was early 2000. I remember flying up to San Francisco. It was myself and our general counsel at the time, Steve Simon, and I were sitting in a room in San Francisco with a great view of the bridge. And we were young. We were in this big conference room. And the people from AOL came in the room, threw down the contract, and said, "We've been talking about this long enough. You have 2 hours to sign," and walked out of the room.
Wow.
Now, they had already been notorious for doing things like this.
Yeah.
But it's one thing to hear about it. It's another thing to be in the room.
Well, especially when it could be the make or break for the company.
It was absolutely the make or break for the company. And I remember pacing the room, looking out of the bridge, and I turned to Steve and I said, "You know what? This just doesn't feel right." It was too expensive. The way they were treating us, the risking the entire company on this one deal that was dependent on another company's performance. I thought, this is just not the right move. And we left. We never said goodbye to anybody because nobody was in the room. We don't know where they were. We just left.
Wow.
We never came back. 2 weeks later, the Dr. Coop thing happened, which was the first internet site to kind of crash.
You're going to have to
And then
give
the
our
internet
audience
bubble
context
burst
for this.
right after that.
So you got to tell this story real quick for the audience here.
Yeah. So this is the peak of Internet 1.0.
Mm-hmm.
All of the companies were being measured based on eyeballs or traffic to the companies. Almost none of the companies had real revenue. And those that did were losing an enormous amount of money. So there was,
like just incinerating cash. Yeah,
right, exactly. This idea of being EBITDA positive was just absurd.
I mean, EBITDA as a concept was almost absurd at the time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Nobody knew what free cash flow was.
Right.
And you had these companies that had these enormous valuations. Now, to be fair, relative to today's standards, maybe not enormous, but big valuations at a time when people only cared about growth. And the way growth was tracked was based on eyeballs until it wasn't.
Right.
And 2 weeks after we walked out of that conference room at AWL, the internet bubble started to crumble. About a month later, it burst. And had we signed that deal, we definitely would have been out of business.
It would have been the end.
That would have been the end of the company.
Wow.
So I remember we went to Big Dean's, which is a bar on the beach by the Santa Monica Pier. And we sat there all day thinking about, okay, what do we do now?
After the bubble started to burst.
The bubble started to burst. The AOL deal was off the table.
Yep.
And we didn't really have any business customers at the time. And we didn't have any capital.
Right.
We had the same few $100,000 that we started with, but we were burning it.
Yeah.
And there was very little money left. So we started begging for money. And this was the beginning of 7 years of begging for money.
What does that look
From
like?
friends, family, VCs, strategics, corporations, anybody that would meet with me.
Loan sharks?
That was part of it. And so went back and forth, flying back and forth, maxing out credit cards, you name it, any way to get money. And we came up with this idea that we would talk to people that we knew at big companies so that we could figure out what to build for small companies.
Okay.
There was one sales guy at the company, Stephen Seymour. He was one of the other two guys. And Stephen had an apartment in New York. I had an apartment in LA. And we both lived in both places. So he had clothes in LA. I had clothes in New York. We'd fly back and forth every 2 weeks. And we'd go to meet people that he knew. Now, everyone he knew worked in financial services. And his friends and their friends would introduce us to people in HR.
Okay.
Now, this was a time when HR tech was not a thing.
Mm-hmm.
There were no HR tech companies. Nobody talked to the people in HR. And in fact, in many of these office buildings which were huge skyscrapers, HR was literally in the basement.
Yeah.
Literally.
Yeah.
You would take the elevator down instead of up.
I mean, they call it back office, right?
Yes.
I mean, it's truly, yeah.
It was truly the back office. And they were all happy to meet with us.
Mm-hmm.
So we would go and we would explain. We had aggregated all this content. There was all this training online. It was much cheaper for them to use this training than train in the classroom. Don't they want to work with us? And they would say, well, we could work with you, but really you have to build capabilities to allow us to manage the training. So I remember one of the first meetings, they said, look, we can't have the IT people taking sales classes, and we can't have the salespeople taking IT classes. We want to train the salespeople on sales and the tech people on technology. We need approvals for paying for the classes. Some of these are more expensive than others. By the way, if you're going to have training that's in the classroom, that's only ever going to be 10% of our training, right? Of course, today,
right.
In some cases, it's 100%. But back then, there was no training online. So this idea that they were going to have this system to manage training, but only do it for online training made no sense. So they said, you have to help us manage our classroom training too. This entire time we were talking to people at these companies who were very large companies. These were the big banks, the big insurance companies. And we were doing it so that they would tell us what to build so that we could build it for the small businesses. And we would go back and forth every 2 weeks. And I remember thinking it's like remodeling your kitchen. When you first were remodeling your kitchen, you would have some plans. I want to change the cabinets. I want to get a bigger refrigerator. I want to put a water filter in and a garbage disposal, right? You have some things that you need to have.
Mm-hmm.
But imagine if you had a contractor that every morning when you came downstairs, whatever you told them yesterday was done. Well, your wishes would get more away from things you absolutely had to have to things you wished you could have.
Mm-hmm.
And you would get more and more creative about what you were asking for. And that was exactly what was happening. They would tell us something, and 2 weeks later, we had built it.
Here you go.
Here it is. And every 2 weeks we would do this. And so they went from the things that we absolutely had to do to things that they wish somebody would do.
I mean, I'm struck that your customers were really defining your product roadmap for you. They were handing it to you.
They were building, they were designing the product.
Yeah.
We would go to these meetings. I'd fly back to LA. I would draw on cocktail napkins what the screen should look like. I'd hand it to the developers and they would build it. After months and months and months of doing this, with the assumption that, okay, we're building something that's going to be awesome for these small companies.
Right.
Because we have the ideas of the big companies and we're going to make it available to the small companies. What started to happen after many months of doing this is we would go to these meetings and they would say, wow, you guys really listen. And then they would start to say, we could really use this. And we were terrible at sales. We didn't understand that they were literally saying that they would potentially buy it.
Please let us pay you for it.
We're thinking we have like 20 people.
Right.
And they have 20,000, 50,000, 75,000 people. They're never going to buy from us. But actually, we eventually figured out that they would buy from us. I remember the first time somebody said, we're doing an RFP. Can you fill it out and come back to us? We had no idea what an RFP was.
Right.
It's a request for proposal that a business will give to a different business to solicit products and services. We didn't understand how that worked. One day we're in a meeting, they said, is this an LMS? And we said, yeah. It took us a long time to figure out what an LMS was.
Right, because you couldn't easily Google LMS at the time.
No, an LMS is a learning management system.
Right.
There was no ChatGPT to ask.
Right.
You had to figure it out yourself. And we just kept being responsive and ended up having something that was completely different than what was out there.
So Adam, when did the switch flip? You're having these conversations, you're building to spec basically.
I can tell you exactly when, because it was August of 2001.
Okay.
And we had developed an
This
enormous
is
pipeline.
an important time frame here that you're
We
framing
had
for us.
developed this great pipeline of financial services firms on the East Coast, mostly in New York, that were going to be the turning point for our company, a great inflection point for our business.
A month before 9/11.
And then 9/11 happened.
Mm-hmm.
And our entire pipeline went away, or so we thought. I got frantic calls from our investors and advisors who were all in New York, who were directly impacted by what happened on September 11th. And they all said, you got to go into hibernation mode. Mm-hmm. Cut the staff. I mean, we had barely any staff.
Right.
Cut the staff. You don't have enough money to keep going. You're gonna go out of business. You got to completely change what you're doing. And I remember on September 14th, I was in LA. I actually had flown back from Boston on September 10th.
Wow.
And I was in LA and I watched The West Wing that night. So The West Wing was this old show with Martin Sheen that Martin Sheen was the president and he would always have these big decisions to make. This was one of these shows where he had a huge decision to make. I remember he was in a church trying to figure out what to do. And he made this big decision that went against what everybody had advised him to do. And on the 15th, I walked into the office and I said, we're hiring. And keep in mind, the management team also wanted me to cut the staff.
Right.
Because nobody thought we were going to survive.
Well, right. We were, also just, we thought the world might be ending.
The world might be ending. The markets had shut down. The ability to raise incremental capital seemed impossible. The pipeline that we had were all financial service companies that were directly impacted. And I thought, look, there's only two scenarios here. There's a scenario where the world comes to an end or these markets don't come back. We're not going to win any of these deals and we're going to go out of business.
No matter what, whether we hibernate or not.
Whether we hibernate or not.
Yeah.
Or actually we're going to close some of these deals. And if we don't have the staff, we're not going to be able to perform on the deals and they'll fire us and we'll go out of business. I said, so I'd rather go out of business trying than not trying.
Fuck it. Let's burn the boats.
We're going to do this.
We're going ahead.
And we ended up closing. We had 4 deals that we were working on at the time that were all close to signature. Mm-hmm. We ended up closing 3 of those deals.
Wow. And
had we fired those people, there's no way we could have serviced those companies. These were enormous companies. Smith Barney, Aon, and Washington Mutual.
And given that it was a moment where we really thought the world might be ending, financial services was hit as directly as any industry was. How did you end up closing these deals? I mean,
they really needed it. It was cheaper. It was better. It was faster.
Wow.
And so it was just a superior product.
Okay.
And so we ended up winning the deals anyway. We didn't get the price points we wanted, but we got the deals. They started out small. They ended up becoming very big. Now, there was one other part of the story that I kind of skipped over, which is, remember, we started hiring web developers and building this consumer app, right? It wasn't an app. It was like a website at the time. And so when we started to be the kitchen remodelers and building what these HR people were telling us to build, our web developers were the ones building it. So they built it over the web.
Right.
Now, when we went to sell it, people were really confused because they said, where are your CD-ROMs? Where's the disks for us to put your software behind the firewall? And we said, oh, there are no disks. And they said, well, this is a capital purchase. How do we manage this? And we said, it's not a capital purchase. Actually, you're not buying anything. You're leasing it.
Right. You're buying a license.
You're buying a license. You're buying a subscription.
Yeah.
Now, this is the very, very, very beginning of software as a service.
But it's fascinating because they wanted the finance team is saying this has to be a capital expense. We have to be able to capitalize it.
Exactly.
But we're not buying a thing.
So we were negotiating with these enormous companies, right? We're this tiny startup. And they were using our contracts. Our lawyers were educating their lawyers on how to negotiate, how this worked.
Yeah.
You know, there were all these clauses about us not breaking stuff in their data center.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens if somebody slips at their office? We're like, we don't go to your data center. We don't use your office. We are delivering all this over the internet. People didn't understand it. It was very, very confusing for people because all enterprise software at the time was client server.
Right.
And it was all behind a firewall. And at the time, people assumed that they would still get their own set of disks
Mm-hmm.
and be able to install it in their own client server environment.
Yeah.
And so we had to train the entire market. Every single deal we did, we were the first software service company at that enterprise. In the early days of SaaS, first of all, was it called SaaS?
Right.
The reason the company really started to take off is because we changed our positioning as how we're thinking about the business. We changed the name of the company from CyberU to Cornerstone. And the lawyers called us and said, oh, you can't trademark Cornerstone. You have to have a modifier. And so we were reading through the S1 of Salesforce, and Salesforce.com at the time was talking all about on-demand software. So I'm like, oh, that's a good name for it. So we called it Cornerstone On-Demand.
On-demand.
And that's how the business started growing.
So Adam, I just want to understand, because if my memory serves, you didn't raise like serious venture round until about 5 years after this, right? I mean,
2007.
2007. So how is it possible that you're signing these, maybe not the price you want, but big contracts, big companies, you're creating a market, but how did you make it work for those 5-6 years before you raised a proper round?
Debt. We actually found Steven's friend, worked at Goldman Sachs.
Okay.
And was willing to get a couple of his friends to put up $100,000 each. Personally, as debt that could convert at their option,
mm-hmm.
or would have to be paid back in a year.
Okay. So it's a convertible debt agreement, but
it wasn't a safe note. It's not like it is today.
Right. And it's dangerous.
It's dangerous. And at the end of the year, they refinanced again and got new warrants. And then at the end of that year, they refinanced again and got new warrants. And we basically were building the company off of sales.
Gotcha.
So every time we sold, we'd hire another person.
Mm-hmm.
Every deal we did, we'd hire more people.
And did you start?
So we were essentially bootstrapped.
And did you start charging a setup fee to fund the hiring?
We were charging initially per user per month.
Okay.
And then we pretty quickly realized we could charge per year up front.
Mm-hmm.
And so that became our working capital.
Yeah.
Literally, the revenue became the working capital.
So why, I mean, if the revenue became working capital, why did you end up raising venture?
Because starting in 2005, we saw the business start to take off.
Mm-hmm. What does that look like?
We were doing 60% growth a year.
Okay.
And we end up doing 60% growth a year, 60% a year. So every 2 years, you're almost tripling.
Yeah.
From 2005 until 2014, every single year we're growing 60%.
Pretty good.
It was pretty good. We were growing very linearly at first
mm-hmm.
because we couldn't forward invest. We had no capital. So the business became very efficient. We were essentially operating at break even
mm-hmm.
from the very beginning. When we finally raised venture capital, Bessemer led the round, Byron Dieter led the round. It was his first true cloud deal.
Mm-hmm.
We ultimately became his first unicorn, first of many, many unicorns that he's had. And we were able to continue to build the business simply by hiring where we absolutely had to hire.
Mm-hmm.
So we were very thoughtful about how we were growing the business, but it was also inefficient. We knew we could grow faster. We knew we could sell more. And ultimately, we were in an arms race with some pretty big companies.
Yeah.
And so we needed the money, not to mention the corporate viability issue that we had perpetually, right? We had no capital. Our balance sheet was terrible. And these big companies we were selling to often would ask, let me see your financials.
Are you going to be around next month?
Are you going to be
do a
around?
deal? Yeah.
And part of the reference selling, right, because we had some big accounts, we were able to get other big accounts. For some reason, a lot of them didn't look at the financials. When we went to Europe, that's when we started to see people really look for financials. But by that point, we were already public.
I'm struck that outside of jobs you had while you were in school, and your stint as an investment banker, and investment banks don't exactly train you to scale a company and to actually operate, right? You go from you and a couple of buddies to now you're Bessemer backed, you're doing business with the biggest companies in the world, you're about to go public and expand globally. Like, how did you personally manage the growth of the company? How did you scale with the company?
I would say I kept learning. I didn't stop learning after grad school. I kept going. I kept reading. I kept trying to learn from people. I remember even after we were a public company, you get to go to these conferences with other public company CEOs, and I would be taking extensive notes. And sometimes the bankers would come up to me and say, Adam, you're the only one taking notes. But I was really paying attention to what was going on, trying to learn from my peers, trying to learn from experts that were out there, always thinking about how can we do better. A few different things happened over the years, and I did it in 2005. I did it again after we went public, and I did it a third time when we were under activist attack in 2017, which is I fired the CEO. So I was the CEO, and I remember one day I drove in to work and I thought, this just isn't going fast enough. This is back in 2005. We had been in a very awkward situation because I had hired a boutique investment bank in LA. I'm not going to name names.
Okay.
Protect the innocent. Well, protect the guilty in this case. But had hired a boutique investment bank to raise money for us. And the company was growing now. We had some real clients. It was doing well. There was real revenue. We were not burning a lot of capital. We were very efficient in how we run the business. And they kept saying, this is great. We got a lot of interest. We're going to raise your money. We're going to raise your money. This is great. I got called into a meeting with them, and I went to the office, and the main guy there says, Adam, you know what? It hasn't worked out as planned, and we're not going to be able to do this anymore. And I'm like, what are you talking about? He said, yeah, this just isn't really working, but we tried. So thank you for thinking of us. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Are you firing us as a client? He said, look, it just didn't work. Best of luck. And that was it.
See ya.
And I thought, oh shit, we are screwed.
Yeah.
Because we were running out of money. And I got one of our existing investors to put up some money, but he said he'll only do it if we raise $1 million. And he put up like half of it in an escrow account. And we can only take the money if we
got the rest.
If we got the rest. And then I went to every single person we knew, every existing investor, everyone I knew had desperately tried to raise the other 500. Yeah. I had raised 350,000.
So you're 150 short.
I was 150 short. And then I got 50. And then I was 100 short. And I just could not get the last 100. I went to every single person we knew. I even tried to get people to exercise their warrants. I'm like, the warrants are like a penny. Just exercise your warrants.
Yeah.
And they wouldn't do it. I could not get anybody to invest. And I was sitting at lunch. I was in New York because that's where I always raise money.
Mm-hmm.
And I was sitting at lunch.
Where were you? Do you remember?
I was at the Capitol Grill in near Penn Station. And I was trying to figure out what to do. And my CFO, Perry, had called, who was the other of the two guys that stuck it out. And Perry said, it's over. We're done. Like,
turn off the lights.
Payroll is due tomorrow and we miss payroll.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, oh, crap. And that was it because of $100,000. And I was sitting at lunch. I was totally depressed. My friends were like, what is wrong with you? I told them, and they're like, sorry, we don't have any money. But how badly do you need this money? And they start asking me all these questions about it. How much do you really need the money?
Mm.
How badly do you need the money? I'm like, look, I really need the money. And they said, all right, you can call this guy, but only call him if you really need the money. You have no other alternative. These guys had a little bit of a gambling problem. And this guy was a loan shark. And I call him up and he has me come to his office.
Oh, he's in office.
He has an office.
Okay.
And he's quizzing me.
Is he in
like
waste
my
management also?
Personal background.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
He's asking me all these questions about me. He didn't give a crap about the company.
Uh-huh.
He might have asked like one or two questions about the company, but he was asking all these questions about me. And he said, yeah, you know what? I think you're good for it. It was the highest interest rate you would ever pay on money.
Wow.
With full warrant coverage.
Mm-hmm.
And I was convinced, like, if we don't pay this guy back, I am going to be in real trouble.
Did you think to yourself, if I just get the 100, I unlock 900 and I can just pay him right back right away? Or did you know you needed every dime?
Well, but we had to cover payroll also.
Right.
So I go to this guy, sign the deal. He wires the money. Perry pays payroll. We had missed payroll.
Mm.
So people are calling like, where's our paycheck? Don't we get paid today? Perry's like, what are you talking about? We get paid on Monday. And we had actually missed payroll. He just didn't tell anyone.
So from that day forward, every payroll was Monday.
Nobody knew when we actually got paid.
Wow.
And we paid payroll, and then like 3 days later, we paid the guy back.
Yeah.
And we eventually, we actually never raised that $100,000.
So
that kept the company in business for another 2 years.
Yeah.
And then we almost ran out of money again. Bessemer actually never knew this. Right at the time that they invested, we were down to almost nothing because they kept delaying the close date.
Mm.
And if they delayed it much longer,
you were going to be out.
We wouldn't have made it.
Right.
So we made it then too.
It's remarkable the number of near-death experiences in a company that has become this big, and I want to make sure that we get to some of what you're doing now. But talk about getting to the point where the company is ready to go public and the decision to go public, if you would.
So we always had bad timing around any financing activity that we've ever done. We've had bad timing, except when we sold the company.
Mm-hmm.
And 2007, the company was still growing very well. We're getting into more and more deals, bigger and bigger deals. The deal sizes themselves were getting bigger. So we're talking about, first 6-figure deals, and we're starting to do 7-figure deals. And our retention rate was perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Literally retained 100%,
churn.
Zero churn. And we were upselling the accounts.
Mm-hmm.
So the business was executing on all fronts. And we were spending very little of the money because we were essentially still operating. We had the same habits that we started with. So we were still very efficient in how we built the business and how we grew the company. And we were building out the management team and the personnel. And being one of the earliest tech companies in LA, we were hiring predominantly for potential, not for experience, because nobody had experience doing B2B software. So we had to hire for potential. And that, I think, served us very well. We had people that were able to scale with the company because they were curious. They kept learning. These were high potential people that were ambitious and willing to take chances and take feedback. And so everybody kept getting better and better and better. The bar just kept going up. The deals were getting bigger. The implementations were more complicated. We started to do global deals. Into the first piece of bad luck after the Bessemer deal was in 2008, we had a number of venture capital firms coming out and preemptively soliciting a deal with us.
Yep.
And the one we got furthest with at the time was Excel. And it was August of 2008.
Okay.
And we decided, you know what? We're not going to do a preemptive deal. We're going to do a full process and get the full value of what we're doing. So we say, thank you, but we'll include you in the process, but we're not going to do anything preemptive. A week later, Bear Stearns goes under.
Yeah.
And then a little bit after that, Lehman Brothers goes down and you have the financial crisis.
Right. It looks like the world's ending again.
Looks like the world's going to end. Now, we still had capital, so we weren't running out of money, but we had a board meeting. At the board meeting, we go over our projections, our forecast, everything else, and they're like, no. Do you understand what's going on with the world? We want to see a financial forecast assuming 0 sales. We're like, what are you talking about? We're selling every day. They said, we don't care. We want worst case scenario, assume 0 sales.
Responsible board inquiry.
So we have another board meeting a few days later, and they say, okay, this is the forecast we want to use. You're running out of money. We said, we're not running out of money. We're doing fine.
But if the world's ending, we are.
But if you assume that you have 0 sales and you have a sales team, guess what? You start to run out of money.
Yeah.
And they said, you need to go raise money. We're like,
in the fall of 2008?
So we have to go raise money in the fall of 2008. The entire financial world had shut down.
Right. There is no raising money.
No venture capital out there at all.
Right.
I said, so you're telling me you want me to go and raise money at a time when nobody is investing so that I don't spend any time working on the business to ensure that a made up forecast can be covered? And they said, yes. And they said, and you're telling me I have to go do it from other VC firms, even though you guys could invest? And they said, yes. I said, explain to me how that makes sense. They said, you're our best performing portfolio company, so you're the only one that could raise money from other people. We need to save our money for the other companies.
Wow.
I'm like, all right, now I know why people don't like VC sometimes. And I went out and raised money.
How'd you do it?
You might remember this. Sequoia had put out this very famous brief.
Yep.
It was one of these early social media posts that went viral talking about what to do in a downturn.
Winter's coming.
Winter is coming, how to manage a recession. And it was cut your people, prepare for the worst, take action early, do it in full, don't do it piecemeal.
Yep.
And the next day, I had a meeting at Sequoia. It had been pre-scheduled to meet with them. And I thought, well, they're definitely going to cancel the meeting. And the meeting never got canceled. I went to the meeting and I said, why are we even having this meeting? You just put out this manifesto about how to cut everything. Why would you possibly invest right now? And they said, in our experience, the best companies grow in good times and bad. And we ended up raising a round. Meritech led that round. We ended up growing 60% that year.
Yeah.
And we never used $1 of the money.
But you had it.
But we had it.
And if the first rule for a CEO, the first job of CEO is make sure you don't run out of money,
Exactly.
you had a board that was really protecting you there
Exactly.
and believing in you, notwithstanding they're not investing in that moment.
And it, proved the point, raise money when you can, not when you need it.
Yeah. Yeah. So take us through going public and then what happens from there.
Yeah, the IPO was incredible. The business was still growing really well. We were very excited about this. I had always wanted to go public.
Why?
Because when I was a kid, my dad taught me how to read the stock charts.
Mm-hmm.
Back then it was in the newspaper.
This is the breakfast table in Jersey with Dad
looking
at the
in Jersey,
newspaper.
Working. And he would teach me like how to invest and how the stock market worked. And I always wanted a 4-letter symbol on the NASDAQ, because Microsoft and all the other companies that were on the NASDAQ all had 4 letters. And that was always my dream.
Mm-hmm.
And so when the time came to be able to take the company public, I was super excited. This was kind of a dream that was about to be fulfilled. And the entire process, which is usually a huge drag for people, for me was super fun, because I remember they have these organizational meetings when a company goes public. And so it's a big conference room. Our conference room happened to have a U-shaped table. And so on one side of the room were the lawyers, on the other side of the room were the bankers, and in the middle were the accountants. And I walked into that room and I said, this is the first day I'm qualified to be CEO, because I was a lawyer, a banker, and an accountant. I remember thinking, this is going to be awesome. And we started building it up, but we were in a race at the time. There had already been a couple of public companies in our space, and there were about 4 companies that were all around the same size. We were on the smaller side of those 4. And I knew that only one of them was going to be able to go public. And the rest of them would probably get acquired or merge, or something would happen to them. I became completely convinced of this. And starting in 2009, I thought, we're in a race to go public.
And you really felt first to the post wins this.
Somebody's going to win it.
Yeah.
And I also believed that you had to have a top tier offering.
Mm-hmm.
So you need a top bank. So we could have cheated and went public sooner
mm-hmm.
with a smaller bank, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted to go public with a top tier bank.
Yep.
And we got Goldman Sachs to lead the round, to lead the IPO. And we ended up going public in March of 2011.
Mm-hmm.
What was interesting, I told you we always have very bad luck. So the way an IPO works is you have to go solicit potential investors. Now, these are big investors. These are big hedge funds and mutual funds like Fidelity and T. Rowe Price and Vanguard and others. And we started out in Europe, as you typically do, and then you go back and do a roadshow in the US. In Europe is really intended to practice and build the initial, what they call book
mm-hmm.
of intended orders from people. And we went over to Europe. We had a lot of meetings. It's a very intensive process. You meet hundreds of investors in a 10-day period, basically. And we came back to the US. We had our roadshow in the US. Super fun time, really interesting. And it should normally be grueling, but it was Perry, Steven, and I, friends. It was just super fun.
Well, this is a boyhood dream come true.
And it was a dream. I remember specifically I was in a hotel room getting ready for the next set of meetings, and I get a call from the head of capital markets at Goldman Sachs. And he says, Adam, we got to talk. We were supposed to talk about raising the price for the offering. He said, we can't raise the price. In fact, I think we might have to lower the price. I don't think we're going to be able to do this offering. I'm like, what are you talking about? He goes, turn on TV. The tsunami had just hit Japan, and the nuclear reactors were melting down.
Oh my goodness.
And people would say at the beginning of the roadshow, unless there's a nuclear meltdown, this is going to be a great IPO.
Yeah.
And then there's literally a nuclear meltdown.
Literally.
The Nikkei had dropped tremendously. And the next morning, all the market indices had opened up really low, and everybody had pulled their IPO.
Yeah.
And I'm like, you know what? It took us this long to get here. Screw it. We're doing it. And we just kept going. And we still had our meetings, and we ended up pricing the deal at initially the lower price.
Mm-hmm.
We rang the opening bell on the NASDAQ, and then they drove us down to the trading floor, and we got to see them start the trading, but it was delayed. And they were waiting and waiting and waiting. You remember, there were no other IPOs.
Mm-hmm.
And we're like, is something wrong? No, it was getting bid up, and they couldn't find the right opening price.
Mm-hmm.
And we ended up opening up 50%. And it was a super successful IPO.
Amazing.
And it was worth staying in the game. And sometimes you just got to go with it.
Yeah.
It's got to go with your gut.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you've done that through the entire journey. So, Adam, the company didn't stay public. So what happened there? And I really want to make sure we have enough time to talk about what you're doing now. So take us through kind of the rest of the journey of Cornerstone, if you would, and then I want to come back to what you're working on.
Yeah. So 2011, we go public.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing time. We kept growing the business. We started to expand in 3 dimensions. So we split out our client sales from our direct sales and really grew our install base with more and more product. We started out just doing learning and development, but as we were deep into the HR space, we added performance management and succession management, onboarding, recruiting, and had a much bigger suite, had the ability to sell multiple products to the same client. Second way we were growing is by vertical. We were adding more and more verticals. So we got into the public sector. We started selling to the federal government, state and local government. We started selling to schools and hospitals, and saw that really any group of people could use our products. We also saw that any sized company could use our products. So we went to smaller companies. We also went to bigger companies. We had over 50 companies with over 150,000 employees each.
Wow.
So these were literally the biggest companies in the world.
Yeah.
And then the third dimension was international. We expanded in Europe. We expanded in Latin America, in Asia Pacific, in Japan. And the opportunity in Europe got so big that it became about a third of our business.
Mm.
So international was almost 50% of our business overall. And what we found was that everybody needs to learn.
Yeah.
Everywhere, in every type of business, in every organization, at any size, at any stage.
And now really more than ever.
More than ever.
Yeah. Adam, you're running a big public company that's grown both horizontally and vertically, but then at some point you're not running the company. So what happens?
Starting about 2017, I started having this recurring dream that 20 years in, I'm going to have an anniversary party. We would do these anniversary parties every year. And I started having this recurring dream that I would get on stage. We would have my favorite band come out and play.
Which is?
AC/DC.
Okay.
And I would do a guitar solo. Now, keep in mind, I don't know how to play guitar. But it was a dream.
And you figure stuff out.
So I would play a solo with Angus, drop the mic, and leave. And that was it. I was done. I was never going to come back. And I started to also believe, as I was thinking about this dream that kept happening over and over again, I'm 20 years in. If I'm ever going to do anything else, 20 years is going to be the right time
Yeah.
to step off. So 2017, we're basically 17 years in. So I realized 2020, I was going to be done. And remember, this was supposed to be my swan song, and then I was out. The pandemic hits, and I even understood what was happening when the pandemic first hit. I watched in rapid succession World War Z and then Contagion. And then I became convinced that we needed to prep for what could happen with a pandemic. And so I did this 3-day test at the beginning of March. We were going to shut the office down worldwide for 3 days just to see what would happen. Did people need monitors? Did people get locked out of their accounts? Were the things that people needed to have? And the whole management team thought I was crazy. Like, what are you doing? You're closing the office for 3 days. Globally, we had 25 offices around the world. Wednesday, there was some issues. And on Thursday, we fixed those issues. And Friday, everybody was still home. And on Sunday, there was a government announced work from home order.
I think we're going to call this episode "The World Might Be Ending, but Cornerstone Isn't," something like that. Yeah, this is every single time.
Every time. My exact timing, I thought I was going to do it exactly at 20 years, ended up being off by about 9 months because of COVID. But we did sell the company in 2021, and October of 21, I fully exited the business. All cash deal.
It's an incredible journey, and it feels like the lessons are plentiful. When you reflect on it, what's the biggest takeaway for you?
Perseverance. You got to persevere. If you're passionate about something and really believe in it, it's not always going to be easy. When we went public, it looked like we were an overnight success, but we had been at it for many, many, many years. Years as a public company. We were public for 10 years. It's a long time.
Yeah.
We're, at the end of the day, very successful, but day to day, not successful day in and day out.
Yeah.
A lot of challenges along the way. If you stay committed, if you persevere, you can succeed. But the other piece of that is you better really be passionate about what you're doing, because it's not all going to be good days.
Yeah.
And you got to remember why you're there.
Yeah. Adam, as we are running short on time, you and I share a passion and commitment to public service. You've invested a lot of time and money in the last several years in a range of philanthropic efforts and political. I'm curious. I think the not-for-profit and government sectors get a bad rap relative to the private sector in terms of how they operate. I'm curious what you've seen as you've turned your attentions to more public efforts about how that world is run and how you are deploying both your time and your capital as smartly as possible.
Yeah, it's a great question. What I have found is that the government sector, and in particular the nonprofit sector, is filled with well-intentioned, hardworking people, but often are trapped in the infrastructure and ecosystem that has been built, and most importantly, the bureaucracy that is surrounding them, and they can't look beyond that. I think the difference in the corporate world, and certainly in the tech world, is that people look beyond the here and now. And people are able to rise above the bureaucracy, rise above the infrastructure, and think about what's next and how do we get there. And you just don't see that. People are overly constrained. Now, you can make the same argument with many firms in the Fortune 500.
Yeah. A lot of big companies.
A lot of big companies can't get out of their own way.
Right. Quarter to quarter thinking, pretty narrow.
A lot of middle management.
Yep.
A lot of inefficiency and a lack of creativity.
So how have you taken the creativity, the inspiration, the perseverance from Cornerstone and applied that in the more public efforts you're doing now?
Yeah. So my second act has been really about giving back to the community. And I think about that both from a nonprofit and a for-profit lens.
Mm-hmm.
And so that means that we've taken, I think, a relatively unique approach on the philanthropy side with the foundation I started with my wife, Stacy, called the 1p.org Foundation or the One Planet Foundation, where we're focused on intractable problems. So for us, we thought about how do we do something that's really meaningful? Let's deal with the problems that are the hardest, not the easiest. And we thought about it from a lens of concentric circles. At the city, the biggest problem in LA, the most intractable problem clearly is homelessness.
Yep.
In the state of California, it's all about education and workforce development. In the country, you have a lot of different choices. We chose gun safety. And in the world, it's obviously climate change.
Yeah.
And so when I started thinking about the nonprofit side of things, I did a lot of research on how do people do philanthropy today? What's interesting? What's unique about the world of philanthropy? And unfortunately, I found that there wasn't much, but there were about a dozen people / families that have done really interesting things. And they all did the same thing, which is instead of thinking about a foundation as a single grant-giving organization, they built a conglomerate.
Mm-hmm.
And the conglomerate contains a grant-giving foundation, typically called a private foundation, a private operating foundation, which is also a 501c3, but is tasked with doing things, not just giving away money, but spending money to operate,
Mm-hmm.
a 501c4 that allows you to do advocacy,
Political
advocacy, and a social impact venture fund.
Mm-hmm.
And all of these dozen or so people had done exactly the same thing. And that's what we did. So we have 1P Foundation, 1P Research, 1P Advocacy, and 1P Impact, all under the 1p.org umbrella. And it allows us to be very creative and very bold with what we're doing in each of those issue areas.
Could you be doing this and put your name to what have become gun control has become a partisan issue in this country,
Correct.
right? I mean, we roll back the clock. It wasn't, but it is
Right.
now. Could you still be the CEO of a public company and be this far out there on gun control?
Well, we don't believe in gun control. We believe in gun safety, but
Thank
yes.
you. Okay.
It would be much harder to do as a public company CEO.
Yeah. So really by transitioning out of leadership, and I appreciate that whether it's public or it's a big private company,
Right.
you freed yourself up to go after the biggest challenges in the world.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the other side of that is there's still a lot I could do on the for-profit front
Sure.
as a private company CEO. And so in a couple of cases, been working on how do we help nonprofits be more effective. So Instill is a company that's focused on helping nonprofits operate in a modern world with modern software and solutions to better connect with their communities and be more impactful. Groundswell is a company that is helping every employee become a donor with their own personal foundation in a way that you don't typically have, right? How do you democratize philanthropy to not just be about 1% of the population, but how do you make it about 100% of the population? Clovers is working on reimagining how we recruit and hire people so that not only are we more inclusive, but we're better at understanding how to get people on the teams that they belong on and operate more effectively that way.
Yeah.
So really thinking about how do we have a better community and a better world, leveraging technology, leveraging innovative thinking, and leveraging the ability to scale. Now, one of the problems with a lot of the solutions that you see out there is that the problems have become bigger than the solutions.
Yeah.
And part of that is it's hard to scale. I mean, look, you call this masters of scale for a reason. Scaling is not something everybody knows how to do.
Yeah.
But if you do know how to do it, you can apply it to multiple areas.
Well, and the fact that you know how to do it, that you've done it, and you're now taking it to these massive problems is a credit to you, and we're grateful that you're doing it. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.